Goons shove him. They failed to grasp. He's a judo master, restraining himself. Ethan Caldwell kept his gaze fixed down as he moved through the bustling halls of Crestwood Academy, his scuffed boots barely making a sound on the tiled floors. At 16, he stood just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed maybe 115 pounds fully dressed. His dark brown hair fell messily across his forehead, partly covering deep blue eyes that seemed to observe everything while giving away nothing. Most students at Crestwood barely registered him, which was exactly how Ethan liked it. What they couldn't discern beneath his baggy hoodies and worn-out jeans was 9 years of judo instruction. What they didn't understand was that his calm manner stemmed not from frailty, but from the self-control his instructor had instilled in him since age 8. What they couldn't fathom was that Ethan chose quiet because he knew precisely what he could do. "Just make it through today," Ethan mumbled to himself as he headed toward his locker. Crestwood Academy held over 1,900 students, most of whom had grown up together in this small Maine town. Being the new student already made him stand out, but being small and soft-spoken made him something else entirely: easy prey. The first person to take notice of Ethan was regrettably Blake Harrison, a 6'3" senior who played varsity hockey and controlled the school through fear and his family's influence. Blake had short blonde hair, a thick neck, and the arrogant grin of someone who had never truly faced consequences. His two closest pals were Kyle Peterson, a burly linebacker with cold eyes, and Cody Miller, a lanky lacrosse player who followed Blake's lead without question. It started subtly, a bump in the corridor. "Move it, runt," Blake would grumble as Ethan stumbled, giggles when he walked past their table in the dining hall, quiet remarks about his stature, his hand-me-down clothes, his obvious vulnerability. Ethan absorbed it all without reaction, his face a serene mask that only annoyed Blake further. "What's up with this kid?" Blake grumbled to Kyle after Ethan failed to respond to being called Ant for the 6th time that week. "It's like he doesn't even care." If only you knew, Ethan reflected. His instructor had taught him that true strength meant picking your battles carefully. A true warrior doesn't fight to prove himself. He fights only when all other options are depleted. So Ethan persevered. He persevered having his backpack knocked off his shoulder. He persevered finding his locker defaced with cruel words. He persevered Blake's crew blocking his path to class, forcing him to be tardy and face teachers' displeasure. The incidents intensified rapidly. In the dining hall, Kyle would accidentally spill his drink, sending liquid everywhere. In physical education, Cody would hurl softballs directly at his head with needless force. Blake orchestrated it all with calculated malice, always careful to maintain believable deniability. "He doesn't even hit back," Blake complained to his girlfriend Tiffany during lunch. "What kind of guy just puts up with it?" Tiffany frowned, pushing her pasta around her dish. "Maybe you should leave him alone, Blake. He's not hurting anyone." Blake's expression darkened. "That's the problem. He acts like he's above it all, like he's better than us. Someone needs to teach him some respect." Ethan heard every word from 4 tables away. His heightened senses, honed through years of training, picked up conversations others missed. He felt his jaw tighten, then forced himself to relax. Restraint, he reminded himself. Always restraint. But restraint became harder as the weeks wore on. The bullying expanded beyond school grounds when Blake's group started tailing him home, yelling insults from car windows. They created bogus social media profiles to post humiliating photos. They spread rumors that he was weird, socially awkward, that his family was on welfare. The teachers seemed unaware or unwilling to get involved. Mrs. Johnson would glance away when Blake made remarks during science class. Coach Thompson never noticed when Kyle deliberately tripped him during soccer. Even Principal Davies would simply nod and keep walking when witnessing obvious torment. "They're all part of the same game," Ethan realized bitterly. "Blake's dad owns half the businesses in town. I'm just some new kid." The final straw came on a foggy Wednesday in October. Ethan was walking to history class when he spotted Blake's group positioned near the main staircase. Blake leaned against the wall with his signature smirk, while Kyle and Cody guarded the narrow passage. Ethan considered turning back, but he was already late for a quiz. "Just walk by them," he told himself. As Ethan approached, Blake stepped directly into his path. "Well, well, if it isn't our favorite little ant," Blake said loudly, his voice echoing across the hallway. "How's your day going, Effie?" Ethan kept his eyes forward and tried to step around, but Kyle blocked his movement. "Blake asked you a question, weirdo," Kyle sneered. "I'm fine," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through his veins. "Excuse me?" Blake's grin widened. "Did you guys hear that? The ant actually spoke." Several students stopped to watch, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Ethan felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, his breathing becoming deeper and more controlled, a warning sign he recognized from countless hours on the mat. "I need to get to class," he said. "Class?" Blake pretended to consider this. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before being such a stuck-up little freak." What happened next occurred in slow motion. Blake nodded to Kyle, who was positioned behind Ethan. Kyle's foot shot out in a perfectly timed leg trip, catching Ethan's ankle as he stepped forward. Ethan felt himself falling, his backpack flying open as he tumbled toward the concrete steps. His judo training kicked in automatically. His body twisted mid-air, hands shooting out to break his fall, core engaging to protect his spine. He landed hard but controlled, rolling to absorb the impact instead of resisting it. Around him, students erupted into laughter. Blake's voice rose above the rest. "Oops, guess the ant isn't very coordinated." Ethan lay surrounded by scattered belongings and mocking laughter. His history notebook was torn and stained. His calculator lay with its screen cracked. But what stung most wasn't the physical pain. It was seeing Tiffany cover her mouth, not in shock at the cruelty, but to conceal her own laughter. It was students pulling out phones to record his humiliation. It was realizing that to them, he wasn't human. He was a spectacle. Something snapped. Ethan rose with fluid grace that caught several students off guard. His movements were suddenly different, more purposeful, controlled. He dusted off his jeans deliberately, then began collecting his belongings with methodical calm. "That was pretty clumsy, Ant Boy," Blake continued, performing for his audience. "Maybe you should watch where you're—" Ethan straightened and looked directly at Blake for the first time in 2 months. What Blake saw in those deep blue eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. "My name," Ethan said in a voice that carried clearly through the sudden quiet, "is Ethan Caldwell." The laughter ceased instantly. Something in his tone, his posture, commanded attention. Blake recovered quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I don't care what your name is, freak. You're still a—" "Tomorrow," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably. "After school. The old baseball field behind the school." Blake blinked, certain he'd misheard. "What? You want to settle this?" Ethan asked, shouldering his damaged backpack with movements that seemed somehow dangerous. "Then let's settle it. Just you and me." Kyle laughed nervously. "Is the little ant trying to sound tough?" Ethan's gaze shifted to Kyle, and the linebacker felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. "If you want to make it 2-on-1, that's your choice. But know that I won't restrain myself anymore." The word "anymore" hung in the air like a threat, implying capabilities none of them had suspected. Blake's face was red, trapped by his reputation and the crowd of students watching expectantly. "You're crazy if you think I'm wasting time fighting some scrawny new kid. Then stop bothering me," Ethan said simply. "Your choice." He turned and walked away, leaving Blake standing with his mouth open and his friends looking uncertain. Word spread through Crestwood Academy like wildfire. The quiet new kid had challenged Blake Harrison. By day's end, everyone was talking about it. Some students were excited to see Blake finally tested. Others were planning to record what they assumed would be an inevitable beatdown. That evening, Ethan spent time in his family's garage, a small space with mats, a heavy bag, and basic training equipment. His mother, Clara Caldwell, watched from the doorway as Ethan worked through his usual routine. "Something happened today," Clara observed. Ethan paused in his stretching. "I challenged someone to a fight." Clara nodded slowly. "And why?" "Because ignoring them wasn't working anymore," Ethan replied. "They tripped me in front of half the school today. Everyone laughed." "And tomorrow you're going to hurt this boy?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I'm going to defend myself. What happens to him depends on how far he wants to take it." Clara smiled slightly. "Your self-control has always been your greatest strength, son. But remember, once you show them what you can do, there's no going back." "Good," Ethan said, surprising himself with the vehemence. "I'm tired of being invisible." The next day, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Students who'd never spoken to Ethan were asking questions. Was he really going to fight Blake? Did he know Blake outweighed him by 70 pounds? Had he ever fought before? Ethan answered none of them, maintaining his quiet demeanor. But something was different now, something that made students step aside when he walked the hallways. He moved with the same controlled grace, but now it seemed less like timidity and more like coiled potential. Blake struggled with the situation. He couldn't back down without losing face, but something about Ethan's demeanor had unsettled him. He found himself studying the smaller boy during their shared classes, looking for signs of hidden strength. "He's probably never been in a real fight," Kyle assured him during lunch. "You're going to destroy him." "I know that," Blake snapped, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The final bell rang at 3:15, and by 3:30, nearly 70 students had gathered in the old baseball field behind the school. The space was hidden from the main buildings by trees, making it perfect for unofficial conflicts. The air smelled like damp earth and dying leaves. Ethan arrived exactly on time, still wearing jeans and a hoodie, still looking like the same quiet kid who'd absorbed abuse for months. He walked to the center of the field and waited, hands at his sides, breathing steady and controlled. A light breeze rustled the leaves in the nearby trees. Blake showed up 5 minutes later with Kyle and Cody flanking him like bodyguards. He'd changed into athletic shorts and a tank top, clearly expecting a physical confrontation. The size difference was immediately apparent. Blake had at least 7 inches and 50 pounds on Ethan. "Last chance to apologize, freak," Blake called out as he approached. "Say you're sorry for wasting everyone's time, and maybe I'll go easy on you." Ethan looked around at the crowd, many with phones ready to record. He thought about months of harassment, humiliation, the way they'd all stood by and watched. Then he looked back at Blake. "No," he said simply. Blake's face darkened. "Fine. Have it your way." He charged forward with straightforward aggression that had intimidated smaller kids for years. His plan was simple: grab Ethan, throw him down, let his size advantage do the rest. Ethan saw him coming with the clarity that came from hundreds of hours of practice. As Blake reached for him, Ethan stepped slightly aside and lowered his center of gravity. Blake's momentum carried him forward into empty air, and Ethan's hand shot out to grab his wrist. What happened next was poetry in motion, executed with the precision of years of training. Ethan pulled on Blake's wrist while simultaneously stepping behind him and hooking his leg. Blake's feet went out from under him, and he found himself airborne before crashing hard onto the packed dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of him and sent shockwaves through his back. The crowd gasped collectively. Blake had gone from attacking to flat on his back in less than 2 seconds. "What the heck?" Blake wheezed, struggling to breathe. Ethan stood over him, perfectly balanced, not even breathing hard. "Get up!" Blake scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and growing anger. "You got lucky, you little—" He swung a wild punch at Ethan's head, putting all his strength behind it. Ethan ducked under the punch smoothly, stepped inside Blake's guard, and wrapped his arms around his waist. Before the bigger boy could react, Ethan had lifted him off his feet and driven him back down with a perfectly executed hip throw. This time, Ethan followed Blake to the ground. The watching students saw Blake disappear under Ethan's compact frame, and suddenly they were witnessing something none had expected. This wasn't a bigger kid beating up a smaller one. This was a technical dismantling of everything Blake thought he knew about fighting. The smell of dirt and sweat filled the air. Ethan secured a dominant position, his weight distributed perfectly across Blake's torso, making it impossible for the larger boy to bridge or roll. Blake tried to push him off, but Ethan moved with his efforts, flowing from position to position like water. "Let me up," Blake grunted, his voice tight with panic as he realized he couldn't move. "Are you going to leave me alone?" Ethan asked calmly, maintaining perfect control. "Screw you!" Ethan transitioned smoothly to a pinning hold, settling his weight across Blake's hips. The bigger boy bucked and thrashed, but Ethan rode out every movement with ease. Kyle, watching his friend get dominated, decided to intervene. "Get off him!" he shouted, rushing toward the fight. Ethan saw him coming in his peripheral vision. Without releasing Blake, he shifted his weight and caught Kyle's ankle as the linebacker tried to kick him. A simple twist and pull sent Kyle crashing to the ground beside them, where Ethan immediately pinned him with a leg lock while maintaining control of Blake with his arms. Now, both bullies were trapped, Kyle's legs screaming in pain while Blake remained pinned and helpless. The setting sun cast long shadows across the field. "Holy cow," someone whispered. "He's controlling both of them." Cody took a step forward, but stopped when Ethan's cold gaze fixed on him. Something in those eyes promised there was room for one more if Cody wanted to test his luck. Cody wisely stayed where he was. Kyle was beginning to turn red from the pressure on his leg, his hands clawing desperately at Ethan's legs. Ethan held the submission for a few more seconds, long enough to make his point, then released it. Kyle rolled away, gasping and writhing. Blake had stopped struggling and was staring up at Ethan with shock and growing fear. "How are you doing this?" he whispered. 9 years of judo," Ethan replied conversationally. "My mother taught me that fighting is about technique, not size." Several students pulled out phones to search for information about the martial art. Within seconds, someone called out, "Holy cow, judo is an Olympic sport. It's specifically designed to let smaller people beat bigger ones." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Ethan wasn't just some quiet new kid. He was a trained fighter who had been holding back this entire time. Blake's face had gone pale beneath Ethan's weight. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Ethan said, his voice still calm but carrying years of suppressed frustration. "You never bothered to know anything about me. You just saw someone quiet and small and decided I'd make a good target." He leaned closer, his voice dropping so only Blake could hear. "But here's what you're going to learn today. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak, and being small doesn't mean being helpless." Ethan stood up smoothly, releasing Blake entirely. The bigger boy scrambled backward on his hands and knees, putting distance between himself and this person who had just completely upended his understanding of the world. "This is over," Ethan announced to the crowd. "Anyone who has a problem with me can discuss it face to face like a human being. Anyone who thinks they can bully me or anyone else at this school." He looked directly at Kyle, who was still writhing and holding his leg. "Well, you've seen what happens." He picked up his backpack and started walking toward the school building. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. "Wait!" Blake called out, his voice cracking. Ethan turned back, one eyebrow raised. Blake struggled to his feet, his clothes dirty and his dignity in shambles. Around him, Students were still recording, still taking pictures, still discussing what they'd just witnessed. By tomorrow, everyone at Crestwood Academy would know exactly what had happened. Blake started, then stopped. He looked around at the crowd, at his friends avoiding his gaze, at Tiffany staring at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything. The tripping, the names, all of it. I was just..." "You were just being a bully," Ethan said simply. "But you can choose to be something else." He turned and walked away, leaving Blake standing in the field surrounded by the scattered pieces of his former reputation. The air felt cooler now, the sun sinking below the horizon. The changes at Crestwood Academy were immediate and dramatic. By the next morning, video clips of the fight had spread throughout the school's social media. Students who had never given Ethan a second glance were now approaching him with respect, curiosity, and requests for self-defense advice. Blake found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the one people whispered about. The story had grown in the telling. Some versions had Ethan submitting all 3 bullies simultaneously. Others claimed he'd learned his skills from secret government trainers. But the most significant change was in Blake himself. The humiliation of being dominated in front of half the school had shattered something in his worldview. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. 4 days after the fight, Blake found Ethan studying alone in the library. "Can I sit?" Blake asked quietly. Ethan looked up from his biology textbook and gestured to the empty chair. Blake sat down heavily, his usual swagger completely absent. The library was silent save for the rustling of pages. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a moment. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Thank me? For not hurting me worse than you did, for not humiliating me more than you had to." Blake's voice was subdued. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing to be something else." Blake was quiet for a long moment. "I talked to my girlfriend about what I did to you, about what I've been doing to kids like you for years. She told me she'd been embarrassed to be with me for months." Ethan waited, saying nothing. "I also talked to my dad," Blake continued. "Told him what happened, what I'd been doing. He was..." Blake's voice cracked slightly. "He was ashamed of me. Said he didn't raise me to be a coward who picks on people smaller than me." "Your father's right," Ethan said simply. "I know." Blake looked directly at Ethan. "I want to do better. I want to be better. I just don't know how." Ethan considered this. "Start by apologizing to everyone you've hurt, not just me, all of them. Then spend time thinking about why you felt the need to hurt people in the first place." Blake nodded slowly. "And if some of them don't want to forgive me?" "Then you live with that," Ethan replied. "That's part of being accountable for your choices." Over the following weeks, Crestwood Academy settled into a new equilibrium. Blake kept his word, seeking out students he'd tormented and offering sincere apologies. Some accepted them, others didn't. He joined the school's conflict resolution program and started volunteering at a local animal shelter. Kyle and Cody gave Ethan a wide berth, but stopped their harassment of other students entirely. Word had spread about Ethan's training, and the knowledge that a skilled fighter was watching served as a powerful deterrent. Ethan found that his life at Crestwood had changed completely. Students who had once ignored him now nodded respectfully when he passed. Teachers who had overlooked the bullying now made efforts to include him in discussions. He even received an invitation to join the wrestling team, though he politely declined. "Why don't you want to compete?" Coach Thompson asked. Ethan thought about it. "Because I didn't learn to fight to win tournaments," he said finally. "I learned to protect myself and others. There's a difference." The coach nodded, seeming to understand something important in that distinction. On a Tuesday afternoon in December, Ethan was walking to his car when he saw a familiar scene playing out near the school's bus stop. A group of junior varsity football players had cornered a shy sophomore, shoving him back and forth while laughing at his attempts to shield his glasses. The sky was overcast and grey. Ethan paused, watching. The sophomore looked terrified, but was trying to stand up for himself, much as Ethan had for months before reaching his breaking point. Not anymore, Ethan thought. He walked over with the same controlled confidence he'd discovered weeks earlier. "Is there a problem here?" he asked calmly. The football players turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty as they recognized him. Everyone at Crestwood knew Ethan Caldwell now. "No problem," the apparent leader said quickly. "We were just messing around." "It doesn't look like he's having fun," Ethan observed, nodding toward the sophomore still trying to protect his glasses. The football player looked between Ethan and his friends, calculating odds he didn't like. "Whatever, this is boring anyway." They walked away without another word, leaving Ethan and the sophomore alone. Ethan knelt down and helped the sophomore adjust his glasses, offering the younger student a slight smile. "You okay?" The sophomore nodded gratefully. "Thanks. I'm Owen, by the way." "Ethan and Owen, if they bother you again, come find me." Owen's eyes widened slightly. Really? Really? Nobody should have to deal with that alone. As Ethan walked to his car, he reflected on how much had changed since that day in October when Blake's group had tripped him near the staircase. He'd discovered that strength wasn't just about knowing how to fight, it was about choosing when to fight, and more importantly, choosing what to fight for. He'd also learned that sometimes the only way to stop being a victim was to refuse to be one, regardless of the consequences. The skills his mother had taught him were just tools. What mattered was having the courage to use them when necessary. Most importantly, he realized that true strength meant protecting others, not just himself. The quiet kid who had once absorbed abuse in silence had become someone others could count on for protection and justice. As he drove home, Ethan smiled slightly, thinking about his mother's reaction when he told her about the confrontation with the football players. Clara would be proud, not just of her son's fighting skills, but of his judgment in using them. The radio played a soft melody as he drove down the winding road. "A true warrior doesn't fight to prove himself," Ethan remembered his mother saying. "He fights only when fighting is the only option left." Today, fighting had been the only option left for Owen, and Ethan had been there to provide it. The transformation was complete. The ant had become the eagle, but more importantly, the victim had become the protector. Character count of 24862.